experiences abroad and what we need to know here in Washington, we're not going to focus on that subject except informally. My name is Blair Rubel. I'm director of the Comparative Urban Studies program here at the Wilson Center. And together with Jane Harmon, our president, and Lauren Hertzer and Allison Garland, my colleagues at CUSP, as we call it, I want to welcome you to the Wilson Center. My role is actually a very brief one. Beyond these words of welcome, I want to thank our partners in organizing this event. And I think this is a model of cooperation among a number of us in town who are concerned with issues of human settlement. The International Housing Coalition, our colleagues at HUD, the Housing Assistance Council, the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard have all joined with us in organizing this event, and I want to thank all of them. I also want to point out that while World Habitat Day was I guess it was Monday or Tuesday, it's World Habitat Week as far as we're concerned. And this is our joint contribution to marking that important day. So even though it's past, I will nonetheless say Happy Habitat Day. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over. I guess, Stuart, you're going to say some remarks. Is that correct? Chris? Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Blair. Thanks. As Blair had said, on the occasion of World Habitat Day, and I just really want to thank both the Woodrow Wilson Center and International Housing Coalition and other partners this week who have really kept the flame alive from 2 years ago, where we had really put an enormous amount of energy. What Habitat for Humanity has continued to do, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Business Civic Leadership Center, Brookings Institution. There's been a number of events. I want to recognize my colleague Christine Auclair, who's come in as our private sector focal point in UN Habitat, who came in from Nairobi to attend these meetings over at the Chamber. So it's just encouraging that a lot of the investment of time and energy and money that took place 2 years ago continues to flourish, and that this week works for various institutions to move forward different aspects of urban and human settlements and housing issues that are of concern to them. So encouraging sign that this continues. I want to keep my comments brief just to two areas. This issue of looking at north-south linkages and at-home and abroad discussion is very close to my heart. I formed an organization in the late 1980s known as Interchange, which was attempting to build on these kinds of linkages as social and economic justice, basically a collective of educators and activists from the global south, primarily in Africa, lots of South African exiles at the time. East Africa, a lot of people from Sri Lanka, together with inner-city activists and small farm coalition activists in the United States. And I think there's increasingly over time, not just with the technology and globalization as we speak of it broadly, but just with time, there's a lot more learning that's taking place that is really much more horizontal, in which ideas are flowing from one part of the world to another, and I think that's an encouraging sign. One of the challenges for this, I think, in terms of what I've learned over the last 25 years, working both in international settings and in the U.S. settings, is, I would say, 5 contextual issues. And I just want to emphasize these for the purposes of the discussion. The panelists here will probably elaborate on much more detail. With contextual consideration in terms of human settlements, broad issues of upgrading, affordable housing issues, neighborhood mobilization, I think what we're looking at are a couple of variables. One clearly is the form of social organization, the way in which people are mobilizing and articulating their concerns, forms of organized community action. In this country, the history of the community development corporations is a very big part of that, and how activism from the 60s and 70s became a bit professionalized through community development corporations as they gained skills in housing and land issues, the range of employment, and engagement strategies. So I think that's not an instrument that exists in other parts of the world, but there are equivalents of it. And it's understanding what are those institutions. If they're not community development corporations, what are they? And what are the forms of social organization? Are they based in the community, or are they community-based? A big difference sometimes. The whole question of decentralization. I find in the United States it's radically decentralized by global standards. The degree to which decisions are made at county level at municipal level, at state level, as opposed to central government. One of the central problems in this country is there's not a lot of national policy. There's not a lot of federal policy. It's so decentralized that its broad frameworks are given to states and to localities to try to pick it up. The opposite exists in many other parts of the world. Much of sub-Saharan Africa is very centralized, and trying to get things out of central government are very difficult. So just as a juxtaposition on that issue. Another is the whole range of apex organizations, national associations, support organizations, community development financial intermediaries, sort of umbrella non-governmental organizations that support community action, sometimes frustrate, sometimes support, always a trade-off, but serve as an intermediary between low-income populations and either local authorities or private sector entities. This type of this intermediation aspect, I think, is something that varies significantly from country to country. A third issue is just the degree to which the private sector is a player or not a player in these situations. I think in the 70s and 80s in the United States, the whole move of domestic financial service industry to get much more involved in low-income housing was a huge jump, and it involved a segment of the private sector in ways that many other parts of the world tried to replicate, and were unable to for a whole host of reasons. Sometimes that was good, sometimes it was bad. But the degree to which private entities that are not part of the government, they're not community organizations, either providing services or selling and creating goods, to the degree to which they are part of this equation, I think is another variable. There are many, so I'll just end with the last one, and that's really what's the role of the state? To what degree is the central government providing a regulatory framework? For many of us in the United States, the Community Reinvestment Act was a huge piece of federal legislation that community organizations could use to hold banks accountable. And this is to summarize very quickly for those that are not familiar with it. Essentially using that legislation, community organizations could approach banks that were about to merge with other banks and say, you haven't fulfilled your CRA requirements. Can we work together? Can we try to look at affordable housing strategies in the neighborhoods and the cities in which you're chartered? This was an instrument that was very peculiar to the United States. I know the South Africans here will say the pluses and minuses of how that could potentially be introduced in South Africa. There's a lot of discussion about that in the 90s, ultimately finding that it was not an appropriate vehicle, but others could be used. But this type of instrument, the role of central government to provide, I think what we sometimes overly use is an enabling environment, creating a series of incentives, both carrots and sticks, that allow innovations to take place at the local level. I think that's another piece of the puzzle. So with these brief comments, thanks very much, and happy World Habitat Day.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Despite the Metro's best efforts, I am glad to be here. I know that it was touch and go, and luckily I didn't scare Susan. The email that I sent said, well, I may not be there, because it was looking rough for a while. So luckily her BlackBerry was down, so she didn't even know any of that happened. I want to thank Susan and Blair and Chris, and I am very happy to be here for HUD. I am the Division Director for the Office for International and Philanthropic Innovation. My name is Stuart Sarkozy-Bonasi, and this is a topic near and dear to my heart, both from what I'm doing now and from my previous life and various hats that I have worn or wear. And I'm really interested in hearing from the panel. And so for HUD, this is, especially for our office, this is something that engages people in this room, people we've worked with. We've already worked with Jane and Chris and Blair and many others in the room on this topic and others. And it isn't news to anyone in this room, and many of you contributed to the research and kind of the analysis that we've been doing, the work that we've been doing, and looking at the scale of this global challenge. And I'm going to talk just about a couple of things, because there are many intersections, but I'm just going to talk about a couple of things that HUD is working on and that we are directly involved with when it comes to informal settlements, no matter how you define them: slums, shanty towns, squatters, favelas, colonias, and so on. And we have had a number of intersections, especially over this last couple of years, in the work that I've been involved with directly. And it isn't just about land use and economic opportunity. We found that out in our sustainable urban housing competition, which I'll talk about in a second. It's not just about security and immigration and disaster, it's all of those things together. So it's also about recognizing there isn't one organization, especially with budget constraints and changes in our economies globally and domestically. It's about all the partnerships that we have and working together on them. And no one can tackle the scale, at least in the communities we're looking at globally and some in the United States. One organization can tackle that on its own. So therefore, it's about partnerships, and that is the main reason our office was created or recreated as the Office for International and Philanthropic Innovation. That means we're working on all of our multilateral foreign government, public-private partnerships, especially domestically with foundations, but also internationally. And of course, some of the domestic foundations are some of the most active and biggest funders for some of the work that you're doing on an international front, be it Ford Foundation or CERDN or Rockefeller. Those are the kind of intersections that we're dealing with on a daily basis. So we're working with all of those folks and other agencies. And believe me, for me, as a new government employee of the last couple of years, that can be one of the most challenging things. But there really is an effort to break down silos and sort of talk across agencies, to talk out to outside partners, not be so insular, and really increase the impact and the likelihood of the kind of changes that we're trying to make. And so we've had some amazing partnerships with DOT and EPA and the State Department, and USAID, and many of you in the room, both on the domestic and the international level. So we feel like this is vital and urgent. It's affecting the United States more and more, and there are lessons that can take us to cities that have struggled as well, because that's another piece of our work, is how do we do sustainable revitalization in cities that are struggling, and what kind of other lessons can we learn, i.e. for Detroit, Cleveland, Youngstown, Pittsburgh, et cetera. So we've spent time in Europe looking at Leipzig, and I'm going to Bilbao next week, and we've created partnerships with other countries to look at these kinds of things. One big thing that I want to mention is the Sustainable Urban Housing Competition. That has moved into a second phase, and we're working closely with the American Planning Association and the State Department. If you haven't seen the entries, you can go to changemakers.com/sustainableurbanhousing, and you will see the 11 finalists, the 3 winners, and the other entries. We had a total of 289. And because it isn't just about the house, those entries really span a great deal of sectors and areas and partnerships. And it also spans what we call the policy process and products areas. It might be products made from recycled materials, but it also might be a government or municipal partnership that creates a policy or program that brings those kinds of products together. So it really, it spans a great deal of different sort of goals and takeaways for us. That's moved on to a Clinton Global Initiative commitment to action that we're doing with the State Department and our other partners, as well as new partners, and looking at trying to develop a much larger scale competition and or challenge, X-Prize hybrid for sustainable urban housing and the kind of infrastructure challenges and scale that we're talking about. So that's underway right now, and we've begun those meetings again with all of our partners. I'm not going to run down exactly the details of them, but a couple that I would draw your attention to are the Habitat for Humanity in Buenos Aires group that is working with squatters and tenants in the city of Buenos Aires. They were one of our winners. Very interesting model I would draw your attention to. There's also a bottom of the pyramid social franchising development in Mexico. They were one of the 11 finalists. That's another one that has some interesting concepts to it and made it through the judges panel and the online. Another one is and we really like this one, innovative water and sanitation paradigm and usage of actual physical shapes in India of the areas that they were working in, and that was one of our finalists as well. And then there's a great public space project in Kibera that was a productive public space and reuse of space project in Kenya, and they were also one of our finalists. So there are many, many more. As I said, there were 289, 187 of which were from South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and 50 alone from Brazil, who was one of our partners on the Sustainable Urban Housing Competition. Sure. It's www.changemakers.com. So it's Ashoka Changemakers, changemakers.com/sustainable urban housing. And all the entries are there, but then you can see the finalists and winners. So we're analyzing all of those 289 right now to move into our phase 2 and the CGI commitment, and looking what kind of lessons we can transfer, look at their application to domestic issues, to other international issues, and we are very excited about a partnership that's under the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas with the State Department and APA to try to do some work that really moves some of those innovations along. And again, we were talking before the session, it's about social entrepreneurs and enterprise and innovation and private sector and how we might do things differently to reach the kind of scale and scope that we're looking at. And one other thing I want to mention before we get to the panel is HUD's work with the Colonias directly through our Community Planning and Development Office. And that's something that had, for those of you who are involved in previous years or decades, was very active for a while, and then died down a little bit. That has been reinvigorated by Assistant Secretary Marquez. In fact, all of them are in Texas right now, that entire staff doing some work and follow-up research on Colonias work. And that there's not a great deal of funds, but there continues to be funds. In fiscal year 2010, there was $12.6 million for the Colonias set aside. We see that going forward, but budget time is budget time. I'll leave that to another conversation. But there's probably 4 big areas where the Community Planning and Development Office is working. One is place-based policy. Second is the consolidated plan that they are trying to reinvigor. The capacity building work that they're doing and what they call One CPD, which is a new way of bringing cross-agency, cross-office technical assistance and planning, and the Revitalized Rural Innovation Fund, which came out of the Rural Housing and Economic Development Grant from previous years. The important things are that in the place-based policy, one size does not fit all. So, and this is being approached with HUD. It's why our office exists, trying to sort of break down silos. Further in the Colonias, that should allow for more flexibility and the kind of adaptation that needs to take place at the local level for those place-based projects. The consolidated plan, as I mentioned, is a way of looking at that set aside for the Colonias and being more strategic about it, finding other dollars to sort of work that plan. And that the balancing point there is the One CPD capacity building project. As that gets underway, the Housing Assistance Council, for instance, will provide that sort of culturally specific training and capacity building in those communities, in the Colonias specifically. And so we're grateful for that partnership as well. And the last thing I would mention is that in August, there was a $28 million set of awards for the Rural Innovation Fund, RIF. We don't like to say RIF because that can have other meanings. So RIF, the Rural Innovation Fund, based on the former Rural Housing and Economic Development Program. And among the winners in the $2 million category was the Nogales Community Development Corporation. And we see those kinds of efforts having much more of a scale and much more of an impact. So I'm very, very appreciative of having the time today and really looking at what these new internal and external partnerships might bring us. And I want to thank everybody that had us here today. And I also want to throw out there, as our office continues to grow and sort of focus on these new efforts, we are very, very open to the partnerships that don't exist, because I've mentioned some that do, but looking forward to those that don't in the future. So thank you for your time.
Good morning. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Director of Research at the Joint Center for Housing Studies. I want to thank Susan and Blair for organizing and hosting this event. We are very, very, very pleased to participate in this effort to try to bring together folks working on housing issues, trying to bring safe, affordable, decent housing to low-income families in the U.S. and abroad. And the Joint Center, there are two communities that have very similar interests and skills, but have often work in silos. And so I think trying to bridge those divides in World Habitat Week is a worthy goal. The Joint Center itself is trying to bring those two worlds together. We have long had a domestic focus primarily on housing issues. If you go back long in our history, in the 50 years, we've had substantial contributions on international planning and housing issues over time. But we're now trying to move into that direction. We have a major study we're doing through funding from the Ford Foundation to look at issues around urban poverty in the Global South, and particularly look at the role of urban planning, what it could be, what it should be, in trying to help ameliorate those conditions to create better living conditions and better opportunities and better integrate those important communities into the metropolitan areas where they're located. So this is a great opportunity, I think, to try to build on those and bring those worlds together. And I think on the one hand, when you look at it, you think, well, there are very different challenges that those we face domestically in the U.S. versus the world. But when you look at the issues and the barriers, and you go through that list, you could be thinking about any urban poverty in the U.S. or rural poverty in the U.S., as well as in the developing world or the Global South. The paper that we're doing for Ford begins by framing what the major barriers are. And to begin with, there's the best, the ambivalence, and at worst, the antipathy on the part of the political structure towards the needs of those communities. And as you run through this list, you can be thinking of the U.S. as well. There's the issue of limited public resources to try to address those issues. The issues of difficult conflicts, whether it has to do with land tenure, has to do with political conflicts, whether it has to do with racial and ethnic conflicts, those conflicts that are between those communities that have to be resolved in order to come to a resolution. And then finally, institutional capacity of the local government, the federal government, of the community-based organizations and the like. All those issues resonate, I think, whether it's domestic or international. I think there's lots of lessons to be learned across those. So I think that the panel we have today really just going to really kind of be a tease in many respects, because the issues are broad and deep. But I think that they'll help to begin a conversation. Let me start by introducing Joe Belden. Joe is the Deputy Executive Director of the Housing Assistance Council, which is a national nonprofit focused on issues of affordable rural housing. Before coming to HAC, he worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He's worked at Capitol Hill and for a number of other policy-oriented research organizations. Joe's going to talk to us about the issues of colonias in the U.S.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Susan, for organizing this event and inviting me here. The original emails you probably got mentioned Moises Loza, my boss at HAC, and I'm sorry he can't be here with us. He had some family complications, a death in his family, and can't be here. And I mention that because I'm a very poor substitute for Moises. Moises actually grew up in South Texas in a colonia in a migrant farm worker family, so has a great perspective on this. But anyway, you're stuck with me. As Chris mentioned, our organization is a national intermediary in CDFI that was mentioned, and we work across the United States trying to help rural communities, only rural communities, build affordable housing and do community development. But the southwest border colonias on the U.S. side are a particular poverty population and a poverty region that we've tried to work on for the last 40 years. I'm going to try to not melt down the PowerPoint here. I left some materials outside, some background stuff that we have about colonias, and there's actually more on our website. Colonia in Spanish, is most of you probably know, simply means neighborhood. In Mexican cities, you will find the description of colonia such and such. So it's sort of like Bethesda or Anacostia in the DC context. It's an unincorporated part of a city. In the U.S., though, as many of you probably know, has already been referred to by Stuart, the term refers to settlements along the U.S.-Mexico border in those 4 states that have very high poverty, limited or no infrastructure, and essentially have substantial poverty and housing problems. They often lack water, sewer connections, lack electricity, may not have paved roads, and typically have a situation where the family owns land but doesn't have the resources to actually build a decent house, so they may have built their own house sort of self-help style using found and salvaged materials. And I've got a lot in this PowerPoint, so I'm going to skip through some of it. Many of the colonias, especially in Texas, where the large majority of them were developed without infrastructure in not very good land tenure kind of situations. They were often contract for deed sales or land contract sales rather than fully amortized mortgages. It's mostly a Mexican-American population that lives there, and they want to be homeowners, they want to own land. But there are substantial problems in these communities. Many of them are very small neighborhoods. Some of them are quite large neighborhoods with thousands of residents. In 1990, as Stuart was somewhat alluding to, the Cranston-Gonzalez National Affordable Housing Act established a federal definition that's still used for HUD programs, and you can see it's there. It's communities built before 1989 in the border states within 150 miles of the border, and that lack potable water and sewer and decent housing. And that 150-mile limit is also used by USDA, EPA. I'm not sure why it uses a different sort of limit. When that limit first kind of came out, we were sort of like, whoa, that's really kind of too far, guys, way up there, because most of them are actually right along the border. But HUD has designated, you can see those numbers there, 86 in Arizona, 15 in California, 142 in New Mexico, more than 1,800 in Texas. So you can see that's where most of them are. And at some point in the 90s, actually Arizona and California were denying that they had any, or they were calling them border communities and so forth. So I think that discussion sort of continues to some extent. Some of them have emerged in fairly recent years. Others have been around for a long, long time. And I think something that's really interesting is that in other parts of the U.S., and I don't really know where all these places are, we're sort of looking at that, there are similar sorts of high poverty, low infrastructure, high need kind of communities. Not necessarily Latino. I know of several of them that are actually in Delaware and Maryland within 2 hours drive of here on the Eastern Shore. But we've seen some of them growing up in the South, particularly in recent Latino communities with immigrants coming in. And then there's some older African American communities around the country, in some cases that have been around for 100 years, but again are high poverty, very low amenity, and actually may have been not annexed by their surrounding cities. The cities have sort of avoided annexing some of these communities. When I was in law school 1,000 years ago in Waco, Texas, I actually worked pro bono trying to help such a community that had been around since the early 20th century, all African American, very high poverty. The city of Waco had purposely surrounded this community and not annexed it, and therefore didn't have to provide services to that little community. I'm going to skip this one. This, if you can see the green, the green portions here are the HUD communities that have those numbers of colonias. The little blue sections there are not the colonias; those are actually the urban metro areas. But you can see a lot of it obviously is Texas. The colonias have obvious needs. They have and problems, a lot of substandard housing, a lot of affordability problems. These numbers are actually for the region itself, the counties bordering on the U.S.-Mexico border, not the colonias themselves. That's a harder kind of research problem, but actually something we're working on in terms of looking at the census tracts where the colonias actually are. But a lot of affordability problems there for both homeowners and renters. This is just a photo from a case study we're doing actually right now in Zavala County, Texas. Highly substandard home. Other needs of the region, high unemployment, low incomes, high poverty, low educational levels, and as I was saying, a lack of sufficient infrastructure, and higher rates of certain diseases that are prevalent. Bar graph just showing the border region has higher poverty rates, as you might assume. Interestingly, the rural parts of the border region have a lower poverty rate, the bar in the center there, than the border region as a whole. For a lot of the colonias, especially in Texas, are actually in metro areas. I'm going to get to that a little further. More interesting than bar graphs, I think, are maps like this. This is a map we've actually worked on at HAC for a number of years. We do an analysis every 10 years of the decennial census as to what it says about rural housing and poverty data, and this is our latest one for the 2010 census. And the purple counties there are the high poverty ones. You can see they're scattered across the country in the places where you might expect: Appalachia, the Mississippi Delta, and Black Belt South. Indian country sort of out in the west and Four Corners area, but then a lot, as you can see there, along the U.S.-Mexico border, particularly in Texas, but not only in Texas. So there's a very, very high poverty rates. If you can read the the lighter purple ones are 22.5% or higher poverty, and the dark purple ones are 31% or higher poverty rate in 2009 or 2010 census. And then this map I always found really fascinating. Well, I've probably been doing too long if I find these maps fascinating. But this is the persistent poverty counties in the country in the last 4 censuses. And it's pretty much an overlap with the other one, but not entirely. There are actually more in 2010. But then these guys have had a 20% poverty rate or higher in every census since 1980. And actually most of them have had that 20% poverty rate since 1960, when the poverty rate first started to be calculated. So again, you can see the same sort of pattern in a lot along the border. In the 2020 census, they probably won't have changed that much. So given that situation of need, what are some solutions? The role of community development corporations and the role of intermediaries and CDFIs was mentioned. HAC is an intermediary in CDFI, and we try to work with groups like this. This is a unique and fascinating organization, I think, in San Juan, Texas, and Hidalgo County. And they've done all sorts of really interesting things. They have their own unique program to try to help families living in colonias build their own homes and put them on their sites. And they're not a huge organization, but they've helped over 600 families, and at very, very low incomes, as you can see there, $5,000 to $16,000 kind of average income of these colonias dwelling families. They build a very basic house, and the families contribute sweat equity into doing the house, 500 plus hours on their own homes, and helping other families build. And they build in a group, kind of a cooperative group. Proyecto Azteca, as this group is called, they also have classes on home repair, financial literacy, healthy homes. They have their own kind of trees and plants nursery to help the families, plant something around their homes, landscape their homes when they get them settled. They use a lot of volunteer hours. They have their own mortgage pool, so they're actually the lender. They've used some corporate and federal dollars for financing, but they've also developed their own mortgage pool, so they actually loan directly to these families that they're helping. This is a house. Now look at this house. This is not in the developing world. This is in the United States. Whoops. And this is one of their current new homeowners who used to rent this property. He built an outhouse on the left of it there. You can see the black hose coming out the side of it over on the left side. That's his water supply from a neighbor's house. Of course, he also has a satellite dish, you can see on the middle left there. But this is a really pretty appalling situation that people live in. And there are a lot of these in these communities. This is another one, not quite as bad, but not very good also. In talking to the director of this organization recently, in updating myself on what they're doing, they were telling me that the new situation there is the HUD programs have really corrected a lot, and state programs in Texas have actually corrected a lot of the infrastructure problems. But now the developers are still selling land with things like with a conventional mortgage, but a conveyance or retaking in lieu of foreclosure thing. So if the family misses one mortgage payment, then the developer can take the house back. And she also says that the families are still not able often to afford to build a decent house, so they're going to the grocery store and getting wooden pallets that that grocery comes on, and making that as the framing of the house. Or she said they even have one family that built their house out of election signs, which she found sort of depressing. I guess after the election last fall, lots of election signs, so put them all together. And I guess you can be bipartisan, do all that. But oops, sorry, this one's slow. What this organization does is they have their own kind of construction yard, and 5 to 10 of the families will build, or whoops, gee, it's kind of going crazy on me here. This is their construction yard where the homes are being built, and then once they're done, they move them to the family's plot. This is one of their families in their new home. And at the Folklife Festival, which most of you in DC are familiar with, in 2000, we actually sponsored this group coming up and building a house on the mall as part of the Folklife Festival in the summer of 2000. Smithsonian officials were very nervous because they thought we were going to move it away. We were going to leave it there, and they were going to be stuck with it. But the bottom picture there is actually, it was being moved down to another group that we work with in Southern Maryland, and went to a homeowner down there. And the picture at the top right is Moises, my boss, on the left in the black T-shirt. The guy on the right in the blue shirt is Dan Glickman, who was Secretary of Agriculture at that time. And the homeowner is the woman in the red shirt. Well, I was not there, but I heard Secretary Glickman was not a great person with power tools or even hammers, so he was a little bit dangerous with that. Anyway, that's just kind of an example. I think this is a fascinating organization, a kind of solution. And here's some other organizations, different kinds of organizations, but again, local CDCs, regional CDCs that we work with along the border. And that's it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Our next speaker is Carolyn Cajato, who is a senior research fellow at the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Carolyn's spending the last year at Georgetown University as a visiting fellow at the Institute for the Study of International Migration. In addition to being an academic, she's also has worked for Urban Landmark as a program coordinator, and has both extensive experience as a researcher and as a practitioner in the field. So, welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you. So while I find my computer. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to be here. As I was preparing for this talk and reflecting on my experience both growing up in an African city, Nairobi, and living in Johannesburg for the last 17 years, and also reflecting on the experience I have as an urban academic, specialist, and activist at the same time, two things struck me. The first was the realization that slums are permanent. They're stubborn, they're resilient, use whatever adjective you want to use, but they remain in our cities. And I remember growing up not less than a mile away from Kibera, and my dad driving us to school every morning, passing by these shanty towns where people had built houses made of cardboard boxes. Some of we didn't have, election, whatever. and asking my dad at 5 years old, why is it that people live in these bad houses? Why can't they live in houses with bricks and roofs? And he would always say, well, the government has something up its sleeve. I heard by the grapevine that they were building houses for low-income houses for people who live here, and they're moving them. And 40 years later, Kibera remains strong, vibrant, and part of our city. And this led me to my second realization, that slums, however decrepit, however socially deprived they are, remain extremely important in our cities. They do provide a function in our cities. They have a function, they have roles that they play. And if we look back and not take some of the sort of the bad parts, the bad sides of it, we might begin to see some of the important roles they play, not only for our cities' economies, but also for the livelihoods of those people who come to the city every day. So those are the two issues that really frame my talk today. I think we know the figures, and I'm not going to go into them. Africa is urbanizing fast. 40% currently live in cities, and in a couple of decades, more than 50% will be urbanized. So it's no longer a rural continent. It is really a fast-growing urban city, urban continent. And unlike other regions where the process of urbanization has been accompanied by improved standards of living, increased opportunities in manufacturing and other industry, urbanization in Africa has grown with poverty. So we're seeing a different kind of process from that which North America or European cities have gone through. We're also experiencing a lot of growth in peri-urban areas, and these are the areas where really a lot of people are coming in. The growth of our cities is happening at the borders of our city, not necessarily inside our cities. And there are some things that we need to unpack when we look at that. I want to show you UN Habitat stats show that we are making progress with reducing the number of slum dwellers in our cities. So in the last decade, 20% of slum dwellers have, 20% of our urban population we've reduced slums by 20% in some of the countries on our continent. And much of the of this improvement has been in Tunisia, in Morocco, and Egypt. And sometimes I wonder whether there's a connection between the reduction of slum populations and the Arab Spring, but I'm not sure whether we can make that connection. But in other areas, we've seen some progress too. In Uganda, in Ghana, we've seen a real 5%. We've seen some reduction in the number of people who live in slums. But while we're reducing the proportion of people living in them, the absolute numbers are growing. So we're continuing to see a challenge that remains. I want to show you visually just how this looks when you look at a place over time. This is Deep Sloot. Deep Sloot is northwest of Johannesburg, a few miles northwest. And it was established in 1995 as a transit camp for a few families that had been displaced in a nearby farm, Zevenfontein. Deep Sloot, in 1999, the municipality decided to plan for these families and built 5,000 houses for the families that qualified for and planned the roads and brought in the infrastructure. And it looked like that at the beginning of 2000. Within 10 years, this is what has happened to Deep Sloot. And we can see that the scale of growth and just the rapidness of the change in the landscape is really significant. And really the question is, how do we manage this challenge and this ever-growing challenge in our cities? I've borrowed, in trying to understand what is happening, in trying to make sense of some of these changes, I've borrowed from a colleague of mine, Lauren Landau, the notion of urban estuaries as really these specific places which are highly mobile, highly fluid areas, where we see really a rapid mix of population types. We see long-term residents who've always been there, often living there on customary, as customary residents or customary law residents. We see newly, poorly urbanized people coming in from rural areas or from across the borders in the case of South Africa and parts of, and other countries actually. And we also see a newly suburbanized class. People who are moving out of inner city and moving to these areas in search of better housing, in search of bigger plots, cheaper land, etc. But the mixing of these populations all have different trajectories and different ideas about what they want from the city. We see a mix of translocal economic strategies. And some of the work that we've been doing just shows how populations or how households really keep two bases two bases. One in the city where they come to look for work, to find a place to stay, to earn a bit of money. And another, and where they invest outside of the city, probably in a rural home or outside the country, for example. And so we're seeing these spaces where people coming in are not necessarily investing in the city and don't necessarily see it in the long term, at least, as a place where they would want to live. Now, this has not only financial implications on the city and in consolidating their homes, for example, but it also has social consequences. Because if the spaces that you belong are not where you're living, but outside, the sense that your incentive to create a community around you also changes. If your location is really to another space, developing a social community around you is not necessarily a goal that you want to work on. These areas are also characterized by a mixed regulatory system, where we see multiple authorities in charge of the same area. The state is not necessarily always the dominant authority. We see customary authorities also responsible for the allocation and distribution of resources, the emergence of local leaders, sometimes gang-like leaders, who also allocate resources. And here is where we see a significant governance challenge. So if we don't have necessarily one dominant authority or regulatory institution, who do we go to, and how do we really govern these areas? Right. So the problem with the way in which we have intervened and public policy has intervened in these areas is that it tends to homogenize urban experiences. It tends to think that everybody really wants to be in the city, is invested and sees a future in the city, and doesn't really take into consideration the kind of multiple trajectories or multiple objectives of different households in these estuarial zones. And that becomes a significant problem, of course, when we're trying to plan for these areas. The other is being so permanent, and despite us understanding that these areas remain with us, we always make policy that tries to retrofit informal areas with formal rules. And this does not necessarily recognize what local communities are already doing to distribute resources, to mediate conflict, to allocate or to adjudicate land transactions, which sometimes are technically illegal, for example, but are really socially legitimate and are the ways in which people actually access resources in these areas. Often there are parallel systems, parallel informal systems, which when we're thinking about how to regulate or bring these areas or slum areas into formalized rules, we tend to ignore. And this really becomes quite problematic. Interventions also that tend to build or respond in ways that, in providing housing, for example, in providing tenure security to people, tend to marginalize the poor. In South Africa, we've seen this with the state's housing program, which has tended to assume that everybody wants a house and a yard to live in and wants tenure. But you can only provide a house and tenure for a certain number of people. And often it is those that have the least voice that get pushed out of the cities, increasing their burdens on transport, economic opportunities, community services, etc. So unwittingly, our interventions have tended to further marginalize those that are very poor. Now, what if we flip our perspective, rather than thinking, what can we do to formalize slum areas? What can we do to make them more like the cities we want to see them, or the spaces that we want to see them look like? If we flip that and ask rather, what opportunities do slums, informal settlements, bring into the city? What do they actually do for those who live there? Then we might begin to start rethinking how we approach policy and rethinking how we approach the solutions to some of these problems. And one of the things that we've been looking at Urban Landmark is how people access land and when they come into the city. And we find that one of the most important things that the new rural migrant says is that this place is great because it gives me a toehold into the city, because it allows me to access the rest of the city. So these areas are almost sort of stepping stones into urban economies and urban opportunities. There are also important areas of supply for housing and land. A lot of our cities really, and the formal economy really does not and is not able to provide enough housing for working class and low-income people. We just do not have enough supply, and these areas do provide the supply that is required. They may be less than, they may not be the best kinds of houses, but they do provide temporary housing for those who need, for migrant workers. They provide affordable housing for those who actually cannot afford a formal house. So it's an important chain. It plays an important part in the supply chain for housing and land opportunities. They also are, and we often tend to look at these areas as chaotic and as completely unorganized, unable to manage resources. But we find in the work that we're doing highly sophisticated systems of land management, which, like I said, are technically legal but are socially legitimate. So if you want a piece of land, there's in one of the areas that we've been working on in Mozambique, we find that there's a local register of everybody who lives in the area and who has bought a piece of land. We find that there are people who have, like chiefs or community leaders, who arbitrate or who arbitrate over land conflicts. There are people who oversee land transactions between people. Now, these may not be recognized on the cadastral system, and the state may know nothing about them, but there are systems in place that adjudicate how people buy land, how they hold it, and if there is a conflict, resolve that. And in thinking about what our lessons are then, I think rather than, we need to learn from what's happening in these areas. And not just learn, and not just learning by broad, excuse me, and not just learning by broadening the, excuse me, let me get that. Yeah, so we need to learn from slums. And we need to learn from some of the local practices that are occurring in these areas. And it's just not by incorporating them into the formal system. We need to rethink how the formal governance system doesn't really serve majority of the people who live in our cities. So it's not just sort of saying, well, let's incorporate them and let's let them be part of our system. But how do we use some of those systems, some of the local systems that exist on the ground, how do we incorporate that into the more formal governance frameworks? We need to rethink our planning approaches. What we've realized in working with communities and systems of the systems of participation often exclude voices that are transitory. And not only that, and not only excluding voices that are transitory, but our planning system really does not have a way of planning for those who are not there or who are yet to come. We often plan for those who are there and for those who see themselves as part of that community and in the future. And we need to shift our planning system to start to begin to think about planning for people who come into the cities temporarily and who are not necessarily visible at that point in time. We also need to know a little bit more about what's going on in these areas. We find that there's not enough research that looks into or that has understood really some of the dynamics that are going on in these areas. We don't understand people's aspirations, what choices they make, and why they make those choices, and the modes of organization that exist. And the more we learn about these sort of permanent, transient spaces and what roles they play in the urban economy and in the lives of those who depend on that economy, I think the better we will be at trying to respond more adequately to some of the problems that they face. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Our last panelist is Julian Baskin. He's a town and regional planner with more than 25 years of experience. He's a senior urban upgrading specialist for Cities Alliance, who currently operating in Uganda, Ghana, Vietnam, Burkina Faso, Mozambique. He's previously managed a large project in South Africa. So truly global experience. So welcome, Julian.
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this gathering. You know, when I was invited to speak, my first response was, wow, they've got informal settlements in the United States. And to my shame, I live in Bethesda, and I'd focused all my time and attention on the countries that I know, which are sub-Saharan Africa and other places. So it was quite a surprise to me to learn that there were these informal settlements in the United States. The other thing that quite surprised me when I read it was that it was a rural phenomenon. And the scale of it surprised me because this is the biggest economy in the world, still. And the scale didn't seem that big. And the first thing, and I was asked to speak on what would be some of the global lessons. And I was foxed. I'm not quite sure what the global lessons are. You know, normally I speak, you know, in Uganda or Angola or Mozambique or Burkina Faso, and it's pretty clear what the global lessons are, and I think you've outlined many of those global lessons. But in this context, I wasn't quite sure. And I thought, you know, the first thing to say that this thing of informal settlements is a global phenomenon. Now, what does this picture show you? This is Johannesburg. Those nice buildings in the distance there are some of the most expensive real estate in sub-Saharan Africa. It's the home of many of the multinationals that operate into the greater sub-region. And right on the doorstep are 400,000 people living in essentially an informal settlement. And then you think, well, is that unique? No, let's go to Dhaka, Bangladesh. The formal and the informal right next to each other. Sorry, you cannot hear me. Okay. The formal and the informal right next to each other. Then you go to Caracas. Same thing. The formal and the informal. But what's really important, I think that the key lesson here is that informal settlements are part of our lives, and they're part of the same space. It's one space that is shared. There might be a formal economy and there might be an informal economy, but ultimately it's one economy. And the two somehow intersect. So I thought that was just an observation. Then, over the last year, imagine this, over the last year, the slums around the world have grown by 43 million people. Now someone's going to say, well, where do you get that figure from? Okay, so maybe 42. Maybe. Whatever. But the point is, slums are growing. And if you look at this graph here, this graph tells you by 2050, a majority of people in the world, this will be the most common experience in the world, will be living in urban slums. So you've got the rural population, urban slums, and down here you have people who live in the other. So it tells you something. There has to be a lesson here. You know, is it all about trying to get everyone into one situation, or is it about saying we're facing a certain reality here, and maybe we have to start reconceptualizing the way forward? Maybe we have to start looking at this in some form of different way. And I just want to make another point about that. Over the next 20 or 30 years, you know, it doesn't really matter. I know we're talking in decades. 300 million people are expected to come to African cities. Now just think about how many people live in American cities today? Maybe 200,000, I don't know. Probably 200-something thousand. So in all the cities of the United States that have been built up over a huge amount of time, that amount of space has to be made available in the next 20 to 30 years in Africa to deal with urbanization. If you look at it like that, you realize unless we do something quite dramatically different, we really are not dealing with the issue. And I usually have some photographs to show, which I didn't want to show at today's meeting because I only had 10 minutes, but, you know, on average, some are quicker, some are slower, it takes about 5 years to plan and to deliver a housing project. You know, some people say it takes 10 years, some people say they can do it much quicker, but if you take an average, it takes roughly 5 years to say, here's the community, let's engage with the community, let's design the house, let's get the land, let's do the planning, let's pass the planning, let's put the tender out, let the contract on the ground, build the house and allocate the house. And in those 5 years, you've now got a housing project, let's say, of 3,000 houses, whatever the scale of that housing project is. There's no resemblance between 3,000 houses that took you 5 years to deliver and the magnitude of the problem coming in. There's just no relationship between the processes that we are adopting today and the magnitude of the issues that we face. And really, it's all about this question of what type of cities do we want? You know, are we going to have cities that are cities characterized by exclusion, or are we going to strive for what we call an inclusive city? And inclusive cities are really about cities that grow with equity. And ultimately, if we continue the way we are continuing today, and if we're looking at urban being how do we build better houses, how do we do everything better, and we don't deal with it as a question of how do we enable and facilitate people's access to the city, we're going to end up with cities of exclusion at scale. And that is what we have in almost every city at the moment. So what are the lessons? Now, this is a bit of an unfortunate photograph. I didn't realize I have other South Africans here who know the details, so be that as it may. I think the first lesson is that nothing ever happens unless there is some serious commitment to make it happen. And this photograph is showing the launch of the Alexandra Renewal Project, and Alexandra is precisely this place I showed you in the first photograph, this area here. A large project was launched, of which I actually worked on that project. And what this photograph shows is the national president of the country, the provincial governor, and the mayor working together say, you know, this is not about the city, this is not even about the province, it's not even only about the country, it's about all of us mobilizing our resources to deal with this issue. So the first lesson really is about political commitment. The other issue, of course, is that the other key lesson is that, you know, if you upgrade slums as an issue of water and sanitation, you almost never ever build community. You almost never ever build something that sustains itself. In fact, I don't know how many times I've been to see development projects funded by a whole range of very credible organizations 5 years later and seen the water points in complete destruction. In fact, often you see the water points being the problem because they've been leaking for so long they've created like cesspools where mosquitoes breed and malaria because no one had ownership of those water points. The point is there's a lot more to slum upgrading than simply housing and land. And that it's about what people need to engage. And these are just sort of basic things. It's about work, it's about skills, it's about a whole range of things. Then the other aspect about slum upgrading or informal settlements from a global perspective is that informal settlements are incredibly complex communities. They're incredibly complex communities, and they're complex over so many different dimensions. So, for example, there's even the complexity between people who are the old residents and new residents. You know, there's complexity between people who think they have natural sort of citizen rights and others are foreign immigrants. There are every friction you can imagine becomes visible once you start to bring resources into that community for upgrading. So you can have a community that seems to be at relative peace with itself. You can arrive and say, well, we want to do an upgrading project, we have X million budget, and suddenly every division that ever existed will start to emerge in that community. And the point is that any planning for communities without proper dialogue, without actually putting the issues on the table, understanding what those issues are, and finding solutions to those issues will almost inevitably lead to some form of conflict in that community. So in other words, it's no longer about community participation. It used to be about, you know, we need to have community participation, therefore we'll call some community members together, we'll sit in the front and give them a talk about what we plan to do. It's now so much more about community negotiation. It's about intra-community negotiation. Groups within the community negotiate amongst themselves as to how the development should take place. So successful projects also invest a lot of money in dialogue. Often what happens in projects is the project is so obsessed on the building of the actual activity and don't actually structure in the importance of dialogue and negotiation as part and parcel of the process itself. And then the other thing is, this is dialogue at a quite a big level. You can see, so, you know, the Uganda National Forum, there's other forums. The other fundamental lesson globally is that it used to be that the urban poor were the problem. You know, the urban poor are a problem, they're draining our resources, they should go back to where they came, etc., etc. The fundamental lesson today is that the urban poor are the solution, and that the people themselves are the solution to the issue. It's not about us teaching people what to do. They're a problem they don't know. We must tell them what to do. It's not about us saying to people that, you know, why are you here, etc. It's more about how we mobilize the urban poor to participate actively in the development process. And this globally, this is what's happening, you know, right down to municipal forums at small secondary cities discussing how they're going to deal with urbanization going forward, how they're going to deal with people coming into cities. If there's another lesson to be learned, too often projects are hugely expensive and very limited to specific communities because that's all the budget there is. Because you can't have a house without electricity, and you can't have a house without a tarred road, and you can't have this without that. And by the time you've got the entire package of services, there's no money left for anyone else. So instead of things being spread widely, things are spread very deeply to very, very limited people. And I think the international experience now is to say the way forward is to really try and spread things out as widely as possible, because the scale of the problem is so big, and to try and do things on an incremental basis, and to make incrementalism part and parcel of the planning methodology. So it's not about having a total blueprint for tomorrow, but it's about putting in place the systems, the structures, and the framework of thinking about how over time people constantly improve the settlements in which they live. And then the other key international lesson is that, and this is something I have a big bone to pick with, I don't know, I'm not an expert on climate change, but I heard a talk about climate change the other day and my bristled on my back. And the reason for it is that they're talking about these vast numbers of people that will have to be relocated because of climate change. Well, anyone who's relocated people knows this is one hugely complicated thing. The mass relocation of people, it's not just about numbers, it's about personal histories and people, and it takes, to do it in any form of just way, is so complicated and so time-consuming, and the way in which the climate change people talk about the millions that are going to be relocated without factoring what it actually means in terms of society and costing that, I thought they really missed a big part of what they're talking about. But be it as it may, the key lesson is that rather than removing people, unless people live in places that are impossibly dangerous, where there's no doubt there will be a landslide, where there's no doubt there will be a flood. But unless, other than that, the tendency is towards in situ upgrading and to relocate as few people as possible. And there's many, many reasons for that. And one of the fundamental reasons for it is that people who exist in the informal economy depend on networks. And once those networks are broken, you're really taking away their economic base. You're not just taking away where they live geographically, you're taking away their economic base. And then the other aspect is, and it's all interlinked, the other aspect is just the importance of breaking away from the arrogance of the professional. And I don't want to be accusatory here, but too many people think they know too much about too many things. And in point of fact, it's often local people that know what needs to happen. And just a very interesting story here. This is a project in Alexandra. This project here, it's a very, very large project. And basically what it is that traditionally, the South African government had a policy of giving, for those people that qualified, a house, and the house was essentially a small house on a single piece of land. And the densities that they were achieving were something in the order of 40 houses per hectare. I don't know, the measurements here are still something that baffle me. So it's 40 houses per hectare, which is very low. And when you look at the number of people that are looking for land, it means some get and others don't. The other issue is that many, many people simply don't qualify for the house because they don't have the rights to that house by virtue of their citizenship. They might come from Zimbabwe, they might come from Mozambique, they might come from wherever. And what was happening was that these people were feeling, wow, if we allow this project to happen, it means we are being squeezed out of the area. And so there was a very strong vested interest to make things not happen as opposed to making things happen. So what is the local knowledge? It came out of that dialogue I spoke about earlier, where you bring together immigrants and other people and they discuss how can we find the win-win situation. And the way this project was completely designed on that basis. And I'm not saying it's a perfect project, but at least there's some features here which start to respond to the realities. The first thing is that the house that used to be a single-story house is now a double-story. And on a plot much smaller than they normally have, what they've done is they've added 2 bedrooms that they can then rent out to immigrants. So instead of immigrants being seen as competitors for the house, and instead of immigrants seeing themselves being chased out, immigrants suddenly saw, well, there's a rented stock that we can rent. And then the locals saw, well, that's fantastic. I've got some revenue coming into the household. And basically, it was a design that came out of pure dialogue and local knowledge. And I think local knowledge is a fundamental aspect of what we do. I think with those words, I've sort of summed up what some of the key lessons might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. So our goal in part in coming here was to try to find ways in which issues in U.S. domestic housing and international housing, there's lessons to be learned. And I think Julian's framing this in terms of 300 million houses or new urban dwellers is a scale that we're not facing in the global north. But I do think that there are actually a lot of, when you went through your list, I think there are a lot of commonalities in terms of what you mentioned, in terms of community organization, in terms of upgrading in place, in terms of local knowledge. And I think that if the pictures you had of those slums in the shadows of downtowns could be repeated in the U.S., where you could look at, well, they're not growing slums, but they're distressed slums. And the issues of integration of the communities into the metropolitan fabric and the issues of community engagement are similar. So I think trying to draw out if there are lessons or that we can learn from across those divides. And I was going to ask Caroline, because I know that you've spent the last year here, and we were chatting beforehand, you were mentioning the fact that you've become engaged in the community in Washington, and some of those things that struck you in terms of similarities between Johannesburg and Washington. And so maybe if you could start off by just sharing some of your observations about the similarities and differences in your experience.
Yes, I was talking actually with Gillian about coming from the global south and having this idea that the global north has got its policies right and has fixed all the issues that it has, and coming to DC actually really opened my eyes to some of the real mirrors that we have that reflect some of the real problems that we face in developing countries. One of the issues of hunger. I'm doing work on poverty and race in DC, and in particular looking at African American communities and African immigrant communities that have moved here. And just having no political voice, issues of governance or issues of where resources are allocated, and the fact that the poor is not an important constituency in many cases in our cities. And these are replicated in my work in Johannesburg, and yeah, and it's just opened up to me the fact that we're seeing more linkages with some of these issues and connections with some of these issues than separations. There's a lot for us to learn from each other, and my work doing this comparative study might help try to bring out some of these similarities and also the ways in which we can together try and resolve the issues.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to open it up to questions or comments from folks in the room. Yes.
David Rasky, the Native Housing Institute, Building One America, and a kind of a decennial visiting scholar here at the Wilson Center every 10 years. Just a footnote responding to the presentation that Joe made. One of the things to bear in mind always, and I'm sure that the levels of need and deprivation are very great in the colonias in the Rio Grande Valley. But one of the things to bear in mind statistically is that in the eyes of the U.S. government, a dollar is a dollar is a dollar everywhere in the country, regardless of very substantial differences in cost of living. I haven't checked the numbers most recently, but not too long ago, the cost of housing in the San Francisco area was 12 times the cost of housing in Hidalgo County in Texas. And so when you fail to take that into account, poverty rates of 30% in the Rio Grande Valley are very different from poverty rates in places like Camden, New Jersey, in the greater Philadelphia area, where the cost of living is basically slightly above the national average. When I look at your maps, I have to bear that in mind. I just wanted to make that observation and caution. You think about the same thing applies to qualifying for subsidized meals in schools. It's the same standard nationwide. Well, you can get a partially subsidized meal if you're a family of four for up to $40,000 a year. $40,000 a year in the Rio Grande Valley, family's pretty well off. $40,000 a year in the middle of San Francisco, they're struggling for their very existence. So I just wanted to make that observation.
Sure, and that's absolutely true. Obviously, the national poverty rate is a broad threshold that obscures a lot of things. One thing I would respond, though, is that the incomes in San Francisco are probably 12 times the incomes in the colonials, or maybe more. Pretty close. One of the arguments that we have with some of our urban housing friends is that they want to create things, for example, like the National Housing Trust Fund targeting extremely low, below 30% of median. Well, the median income in the D.C. area, for example, is $90,000. The median income in some of these communities is $25,000. So it's a very different kind of threshold, yeah. But.
In the back of the room there?
Thank you. I have some questions that pertain to the colonias too. It talks about a higher rate of certain types of diseases. Could you touch on specifically what types of diseases those are, as well as touch on some of the social ills and things that are more so rampant or at a higher level in the colonias than in the surrounding areas that are outside of the colonias?
Yeah, I was afraid you might ask me about the diseases because I don't really know. I can. There are certain waterborne problems. They tend to have very poor water quality. The temperatures are not terribly cold there, but they often are in these houses. Of course, they have almost no insulation. So I'm sorry, I don't really know a lot of details about the diseases, but I can find out for you if you want to leave me your card. I can find you more about it. And there are organizations that specialize on health in the border region. But
Anything about the violence or the social ills that may exist, the rates that may exist there in the colonies?
Again, I think I don't know enough about that but if I can find more about it for you. Yeah.
This gentleman right here, and then back of the room after him.
Thank you. I'm Dave Liebson, and I guess I spent 35 plus years in slums and upgrading projects. In the last 15, I've been working with Arlington County, not working as a volunteer with Arlington County across the river, and learning about how things in the U.S. And I'm struck by a couple things. Two quick comments and then one question. On lessons, I guess I came to the meeting thinking more about lessons from overseas for the U.S. rather than vice versa. And the one of them that's really struck me all the time is, in the slum improvement projects, we're always looking at the incremental improvement, the core housing, start small, let people put their own sweat into it and so forth. And I've always been trying to figure out, why can't we have core housing in the States? What are our legal structures that are preventing us from doing that? And also add, by the way, we have, particularly in the cities, we do have a lot of informal housing in the form of homelessness and street people. I'm chair of the county's task force on homelessness right now, so I'm fixated on that. Then conversely, I think, Julianne, you put your finger on, I think, a real important lesson from the U.S. for slum improvement overseas is the whole rental structure. The largest part of our affordable housing in the U.S. is in rental forms, and how can that translate? My question is for Joe on the Colonias. You mentioned that you were talking about the levels of poverty in the Colonias, and you mentioned that some of them are actually in the urban areas.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious about the legal structure. Are those, as we see overseas, illegal settlements? Are they legal? If they're illegal, how are we dealing with that?
I think most of them are not, and maybe almost none of them are illegal in the sense of being squatter kind of settlements. And there are many in the metropolitan areas, the McAllen, Brownsville metropolitan area in far south Texas, down the far south. That's where this group Proyecto Azteca works, and it's actually in a metro area, but sort of an expanded several county metro area, and with rural portions and unincorporated, unannexed areas, often without city services. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the other part of your question. The illegal. No, typically the families own their land, but it's been sold to them historically by an unscrupulous developer because it's just raw land without resources. They want to own the land, but then it's not connected to water, wastewater, and they don't have the resources to do that.
That sounds to me like
yeah.
overseas it's the same thing. It's basically illegal subdivision.
Well, yes, they're pretty much illegal now. Historically, though, they weren't illegal. There was kind of lax local government, to make them illegal. Yeah, they should have been, but they weren't. Yeah.
Fellow in the back there.
Hi, I'm Michael Donovan from USAID. Last year I was at the OECD and I helped author the forthcoming Hauteng City Region Review. And one of the items that struck me in the research was that, I guess in the past 14 years, governments in Hauteng have rolled out about 900,000 RDP units, public housing units. But despite of this, the housing deficit in Hauteng is larger than it was in 1995. This is often due to population growth, it's due to uncrowding and so forth. So I'm wondering, given the inability of government to actually meet the housing deficit, despite their approach, even if they were to pursue an Alexandria model, what role, if any, do you see for low-income housing developers? And what are the main barriers of low-income and affordable housing development, especially rental?
Julie, you wanna?
All right. Just to premise that I've actually been involved in building something like 55,000 of those RDP houses. The big issue was this notion that somehow the numbers that they picked up at a certain point of time, they could ring fence and deal with them politically as a backlog. and then changed policies somewhere along the line, and all the new people coming in were no longer the black backlog, but because it was somehow a democratic dispensation, they would have been dealt with in some just way, and in that way, some sense of equity would have been established. The point is that the numbers just kept on changing. You know, so if your starting premise is a count on the number of shacks, and then you say, well, there are X number of shacks, therefore we need X number of houses, and you don't take into account that under apartheid it was almost impossible for people to get land, therefore inside of those shacks were 2 or 3 families. The second access to land became available, and the state was less repressive around land invasions and things. Suddenly you had the same number of people now occupying 3 or 4 times the number of shacks than at the point in which they calculated the backlog. The point is that the numbers just kept changing, even though the population might have been the same at some point. Then the other aspect is, in a situation where you have collapsed neighboring economies and you have small towns that are not performing, what happens is that, first of all, you get migration into where the work is, and it's a very different type of migration, because this migration, the people are actually quite integrated through marriage and all sorts. So it's very hard to work out who's a migrant and not a migrant. It's not a question of saying you look like this, therefore, and you speak like that. So you have that sort of influx coming in, and then. Okay, so I don't want to make it too complicated, but the point is that this number just kept on growing and growing and growing. But perhaps the worst mistake that was made was to not recognize just how migratory populations are. And what happened is that people were given housing there because that's where they were counted, and when they were offered a house, they said, well, fair enough, I'll take it there. But then moved there to find work, and now got picked up there in the new spot as being without a house. And so you started getting people being double supplied, triple supplied, as people moved to where the houses are. And the point is that with the urban poor, there's a mass migration that goes wherever the opportunities are. You know, so you might live this side of the city now and put your shack there now, and the government comes to you now and says, well, you can't live in a shack, you must have a house. You say, okay, I'll have a house. But if the work shifts to the other side of the city, it's not that you're going to commute by train every day by the red line, orange line. You're going to pick up, and you're going to build your shack close as possible as you can in the new area, and therefore, again, you're now seen not to have a house. So my point is that the whole question, no matter how many houses you build, you're going to be behind this game. And that's what they found themselves in.
So what about the other part of that question had to do with the role of private development, potentially, and particularly in rental housing, which...
Sure. You're really asking me to get involved with the politics of South African housing. and I get sensitive to this because I was once put in the dock for 5 days under cross-examination by the Legal Resources Centre, trying to justify why I, as the senior government official, could not provide this old lady who was being evicted with a house immediately, and why government was unable to provide housing for people, and I had to explain the whole policy and et cetera, et cetera. And it took a week in the dock, being cross-examined about housing. So what was the question? No, about the private sector, okay. So the issue here was when the South African housing policy started, it was actually a land tenure-based policy. The idea was to subdivide land and with a fixed budget. So there was an amount of money, and it was called a subsidy because it was subsidizing a greater amount. And the greater amount was meant to be mobilized by the household itself. And the idea was you'd give people access to land, and then the community would negotiate around what they called a social compact, how they would utilize the money. So would they utilize it on tar roads or dirt roads? Would they utilize it on pit latrines or waterborne sewer? And a range of choices became local choices. And then, if there was any money left over, there would be some sort of base structure that they could stay in that would enable them then to build their own house on that site. But the starting premise was very much incremental housing based on land tenure and households providing housing for themselves. What then happened is the private sector came to government and said, no, 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 no. A far better way of doing this is we can mobilize these huge housing projects, and you just pay us, and we will build these massive, massive, massive housing projects. And what happened is that it shifted away from land tenure and incremental housing to mega contracts to private sector contractors. But the money didn't go up. And what happened in the process was, in order to get the profits and to justify it, so they started to squeeze, 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 until you start getting houses that are falling down, the roofs are leaking, the toilets don't work, and housing, far from becoming a prize for government, and the fact that housing people became a political disaster for government, because what happened was you were handing over liabilities to people rather than assets to people. And so the whole question of how the private sector gets involved is really, it can only happen, the private sector can function when they function in a normal market type of economy, and where there are mechanisms that enable people to enter into that market. But when it's a free gift house, where people make no contribution to that house, and where the budget is fixed, and where they're escalating construction costs, it's obvious what's going to happen. And so that's more or less what happened in South Africa.
This gentleman here.
Bob Dubinsky with the International Housing Coalition. I'd like to put Julian on the spot again, if you don't mind. I agree with your idea that probably too much of our urban upgrading is in depth, and you try to do everything for everybody, though you can only do it for a small number of people at the same time. But could you talk a little bit about what an incremental urban upgrading project would look like, or what some of the priorities would be, or how long it would take? But put your arms around what an ideal project might look like.
Okay. I don't feel on the spot at all, because it's something which I feel quite passionately about. You know, the problem with the in-depth approach is that it's almost impossible to ring-fence those communities from the broader competition that's happening outside. So if we took the Alexandra case study, which was precisely that, where government committed a huge amount of money to do a full integrated upgrading of that area, including every social facility, all the urban services, etc., the project started at 160,000 people, ended up with 400,000 people living there, because that is where the investment was. That is where the money was being spent. So if you're going to have an upgrade that is about all the money in one area and nowhere else, you're talking about competing interests, and people will find their way where the development is happening and the resources are happening. So the question is then, how much money do you have, and how do you spread it out as widely as possible so that it still has an impact? You don't go to the extreme opposite end, which is you spread it so widely that no one even notices what you're doing. So there's a degree to which there's a balancing between the width and the depth. Now, it's very, very seldom, it's very, very seldom that you'll go into a community and talk about priorities that when people have no water and no toilets, where water and sanitation doesn't become the number one priority, other than jobs. I mean, jobs is always, So any program is going to have to start somehow or the other around water and sanitation, because that's always the baseline. And in communities that don't have that, that's always going to come up to the top. But then there are other issues. There are other issues, for example, of accessibility. Just having one road through a settlement enables emergency vehicles to reach a point. So if you can have one road here, and everyone have that, and then when everyone has that one road, you come back for a second round, and another road comes, etc. So my point is, what I'm advocating is really a citywide approach to something, as opposed to a settlement-specific approach. In those contexts where cities have many more than just one settlement. So in some cities in the world, it's not a question about even saying, it's not even about saying that you have an informal settlement. The entire city is an informal settlement. I don't know if that answers your question. My point is to say that the principle is a citywide as opposed to a settlement-specific approach.
Just to get a little more specific, though, I mean, you're talking about something like a 20-year program of upgrading or something of that nature, and you do it incrementally. Is that your concept?
Even when you do an in-depth program, it'll take you 25 years. The idea that you can do this quickly and turn it around, in all the experience, whenever I look at upgrading, when I talk about long-term, I'm talking a vision of about 20, 25 years before we start to see the necessary services, etc. Yes. It's a very long-term commitment. It's a commitment to your city over time. Got to start young.
I think we had time for one more question. Yes, Conrad.
Actually, I just wanted to follow up on that series of questions. I'm Conrad Egan with the Affordable Housing Institute. I wanted to ask you, Julian, to deal with what seems to me to be a discrepancy or maybe a conflict between the incremental approach, which takes a long time and it's slow, but it's maybe better, and the massive kind of approach that you don't seem to favor, if we're going to get to 250 million homes in the near future.
The contrast. Yeah.
How do you reconcile the apparent discrepancy between those two approaches, strategies, if you want to get to your goal?
If you take a place like Luanda, Angola. Luanda is basically a city of 7 million people. The entire city is essentially a slum. It happens to be an oil-producing country with massive oil revenues. The state's idea is to try and rebuild the city from scratch next door. So the idea is, such a disaster here, it's not even worth looking at incremental upgrading, and they're going to see where they can build a new city in the north of the city. So that's one type of particular circumstance. If you go to a place like South Africa, for example, where you have basically two different types of populations. You have one type of population that is stuck in informal settlements because there are no alternatives for them. And if they were given alternatives by virtue of affordable housing, by virtue of some form of social housing association that could make rents more affordable, those people do and will move from the informal settlements into those type of options. And those options lend themselves to construction, lend themselves to companies getting contracts based on some sort of financial model that works for those type of people. But then you get another type of people. And these are people who don't see their primary identity or primary purpose in that specific spot where they live. These are the people that, even if they do have money, might send the money back to a rural area or even to another city because they judge their status by virtue of when they go home and what that house might look like. These are also the people that might say, well, I'm working here now, but I need to work there later, and therefore I will move. These are people for whom the informal settlements actually make a lot of sense. These are the people that informal settlements provide them the type of flexibility they need to survive and to work within their type of economy. In those type of settlements, and they're in huge in number, in those type of settlements, I absolutely advocate the notion of incremental improving of services over time. Of course, you still have to have water, you still have to have sanitation, you still need to have basic roads, you still need to have basic services, etc. So I do draw that type of distinction. I don't know if that answers. So there are different strategies for different circumstances. It's not a question of only advocating one strategy for all circumstances.
Great, well, thank you. I don't know if Caroline or Joe have any final words they want to say?
Well, yeah, I just might want to offer one little further tidbit at the micro level about this group that I talked about in South Texas, my little case study, Proyecto Azteca. They've in the self-help sweat equity model that they live, the families have put over 500 hours in their homes, so they know how to fix them and maintain them and repair them. They know how to find the studs. I can't find a stud in my house in the walls. And another thing I think is fascinating, they've done over 600 homes. They've done, I think, 300 or 400 of those with their own mortgage pool. So they're the lender, they're the bank with the families. They work with the families to stay current. In the last 5 years, I checked with them a couple days ago, last 5 years they've had 1 foreclosure and 2 conveyances in lieu of foreclosure, even at that income level. So we should have used them instead of Countrywide.
Any last words?
Yeah. I think it's just to kind of strengthen some of the points that Julian was making, particularly around slums and the way we see them. And it really is truly that they do play an important role in the lives of some of those who are coming to the cities. And the question then is, do we formalize them and provide, these big houses and the full Monty in terms of tenure and housing, etc.? Or are there ways in which we can improve them at an incremental level, slowly by slowly, so that at least people don't live in situations of complete squalor? And maybe it means adjusting our lenses a little bit and not having such almost Western visions of how we understand cities, and maybe looking at slums in ways that, or at shantytowns, in ways that help us readjusting our lenses so that we as long as we provide the basics, and that we can do that slowly, that they are there to stay and that we can live with them in the way that they are. Thank you.
Great. Well, with that, I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Susan and Blair again for hosting and sponsoring this event, for Chris and for Stuart, as well as for our panel. So please thank me and join me in thanking everyone.
These Western models just, they're kind of imposing this kind of thing.